Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Cameron English, Director of Biosciences at the American Council on Science and Health with you. Joined again by my colleague, Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, our Director of Medicine. Chuck, what's going on in your life? How are you?
Oh, man, it's starting to be summer here on Long Island, and it is gorgeous. 65, 70 degrees, blue skies. It's a beautiful, beautiful day. I'm a happy man.
Yeah, baby. Time to break out the Mai Tais.
Exactly. Or at least get the tiki bar open up.
All right. Well, welcome to you all listening. Thank you so much for joining us again. We've got two new stories to talk about. First one deals with the possibility that salt may not actually be all that bad for you, despite the advice that we've gotten over the decades. And we've also got a story about SIDS, always an uplifting and happy topic. But in this case, we actually do have some good news about some research that's starting to hone in on possibly helping us identify children that might be at risk for SIDS. So this is all really good stuff, Chuck. But you're the author of this first story, Another Dogma Falls, Salt Restriction. So what are you talking about here?
Well, salt restriction has been a standard of dietary advice by physicians for some time. We have too much salt in our diet, primarily because of processed foods, and salt has been associated with certainly hypertension and is associated with other cardiovascular problems. The one they looked at in particular for this study was congestive heart failure. And what happens in congestive heart failure is the heart acting as a pump fails. It cannot move the blood around as effectively as it might. And as a result, blood backs up. It can back up into your lungs and make you short of breath, or it can back up into your legs and cause swelling in your legs and make your ability to get around more limited. And so the dogma has always been that for these patients, salt is to be restricted, and the levels they usually talk about is 1.5 grams. Now, most people in the United States are probably eating somewhere in the order of 3 grams. So this is a significant degree of salt restriction. And the study looked at a bunch of patients with mild to moderate heart failure, meaning that they had some symptoms of shortness of breath, they had some problems getting around, but they were not at the point yet that they needed to be hospitalized and placed on oxygen. These were the walkie-talkies in the world of congestive failure. And half of them were put on a sodium-restricted diet of 1,500 milligrams, 1.5 grams a day. And the other group was left to their own devices. And when they looked at them, they found that there was actually no difference at all. These patients didn't have any more shortness of breath. They didn't have any more limited mobility. They had no increase in their heart failure when they were taking the lower amount of salt. So it really calls into question whether restriction for this group is worthwhile. And there's been a lot of back and forth, and in fact, there's been legislation about it that nursing homes could or could not have certain amounts of regular table salt available to the nursing home patients. There's a whole industry of salt substitute, which is really potassium chloride. It doesn't have the sodium in it, which is what causes the bulk of the water retention, which is also there. So these things don't seem to be pertinent. There's also some suggestion that salt may transiently increase your blood pressure, but it doesn't seem to be cause of chronic hypertension. So that may be another shibboleth to fall. When I've looked at the problem more generally, the Chinese by far ingest more sodium than anybody else on the planet. Their average is 5 grams. And when you think about soy sauce and some of the other pickled condiments, it does make a certain amount of sense, but there's no evidence that there is much more heart failure or hypertension among the Chinese population than there is in a Western population. The other group that seems to be also particularly salt sensitive on the other end of the spectrum are people of African origin. And this very well may have be related to the climates in which their genetics evolved. Now, you take these people and you bring them willingly or unwillingly to the United States and you put them on a salt diet, they very well may develop evidence of hypertension related to salt. So the bottom line of the story is that, once again, we can't make generalizations about dietary components, that there is a evolutionary genetics component that we rarely considered.
So to get a little more specific, from the numbers I'm looking at in your article, at 12 months, it looks like there was basically no difference in terms of all-cause mortality or emergency department visits between these two groups. So, I mean, if people are looking at the data, would something like this say, oh, we've got this wrong, we need to start to reevaluate and maybe start to refine the advice that we're giving to different groups of people based on their genetics maybe, or their family history, whatever that may be?
Yes. It's personalizing the treatment to the patient in front of you. Does this finding about sodium restriction apply to all populations? Probably not. But it certainly applies to a lot more of the population than we thought in the past. And it's very difficult for the dogma of medicine to change quickly. Medicine is a very conservative field. We move slowly because, there's lots of things at stake. In fact, I think there was a paper this week on another topic talking about doctors using antibiotics for viral conditions and other conditions where they're not indicated. And we've been fighting that battle for several years, and physicians continue to do it. So turning the medical boat around, so to speak, is going to take us some work.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I was going to ask, I've seen that sort of phenomenon with other aspects of nutrition. So I remember, this is years ago now, but you started to see studies coming out showing that at least some people fare very, very well on a high saturated fat diet, especially when you look at a country like France, for example. And you saw doctors here in the United States saying, well, that's the French paradox. But then it started to show up in another country and they'd say, oh, well, that's the, that's the Spanish paradox. And, so it almost seems like, and this is not unique to people in medicine, but it seems like instead of being willing to follow the data where it goes, sometimes we're inclined to try to adjust it to fit into our pre-existing understanding of some of these health issues. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, it's absolutely true now. And part of it, again, has to do with the changing definitions within medicine. There's a lot of talk lately about our definition of gender. And I'm going to leave that aside for another day. But the same holds equally true when you begin to talk about what we would think would be simple as race. As it turns out, and there's studies to show that Black Americans are not a monolithic racial group. They come from across the diaspora, and the Caribbean Blacks are different genetically from the African Blacks, and their response to medications are going to be different. The same can be said about the Caucasians. I mean, the Caucasians that come from Northern Europe have a different genetic profile than the Caucasians that are coming out of the Caucasus Mountains, let alone Southern Europe.
So I think overall this is pretty good in that it's the way that these issues seem to move as time goes on is people are different, and we just need to recognize that. Someone might do really well on this kind of a diet. Someone else is going to do poorly on that diet. And we know that because we've put them both on that same diet.
Exactly. And what I was trying to get at with the racial idea is that the category of Black American being non-monolithic, there's a lot of subgroups. And as we get more and more into the science, we begin to start to separate those groups out into more homogeneous subgroups. And then that's where this kind of treatment would make a difference. If you can identify the people that are salt sensitive, then those are the people where you should try to avoid salt. But the overwhelming number of people, at least in this study and in this country, are not salt sensitive in the same way, and they don't need the same recommendation.
Before we move on, overall, are you confident in the quality of this study? I know you mentioned it was an open label trial, so everybody involved knew what they were doing. Do you think that could have influenced the results in any meaningful way?
I think it may have influenced the results, but what they found was that there was no difference. So you would think that the people that were on the low sodium diet would, if anything, try to say that they were doing better because they were on the approved diet compared to the ad lib do what you want diet. So I think that it's a reasonable finding, and that we should start to become a little bit more specific when we give our dietary advice, at least on this one. And there's it's just another one of those beliefs that we've held for a long time that turn out to be more theoretical than what we can prove in the lab or among the population.
Very good. Well, hopefully people start adapting to the science as it comes out. But I guess we'll just have to see. But let's talk a little bit about sudden infant death syndrome. And this whole little affair surrounding the study was really interesting, Chuck. So let's talk a little bit about the paper itself and what they found, and then we can talk about the media response to it. As some of our readers probably know, because I don't shut up about it, I'm a new dad, and this sort of research obviously brings a little bit of relief to parents when they find out about it, because, and I talked about this in the story, it's happened in my family. You put a kid to sleep, they're perfectly healthy, and then you wake up the next morning and they've died. And I know that the tragedy that this is and the impact it has on families, it's just devastating. And the advice you get, and I'm sure you have some insight here, the advice you get from pediatricians and other people with the relevant expertise is put your babies to sleep on their back, don't put anything in their crib, but don't put anything in there that would prevent them from rolling over, because that's bad too. And so as a new parent, especially in the first 3 months, I'd say this is just nerve-wracking because you're sleep deprived for one thing, but then people are giving you good advice, but they are necessarily cautious in what they're telling you because they can't say, if you do this, nothing bad will happen, because they just can't guarantee that. But as a new parent, you're trying to figure all this out and you're just sort of left in a lurch, and it's not really anybody's fault, but you're still left in this situation. So to get results like this, and just to put it very briefly, we can get into the details of study. Very briefly, they basically believe they have found a biomarker that they can use to identify children before they pass away who might be at risk for SIDS, because the only way you diagnose it at this point is once the child is deceased, you do a death scene investigation, you do an autopsy, all these typical things. And if you can't find anything else, then someone, like a medical examiner will say, okay, this was probably a case of SIDS. But let's go into the details of the paper a little bit and talk about this altered activity of this enzyme, Chuck. What's going on here? Okay, I want to get a little deeper.
Okay, I wanted to take it back, and it actually ties in a little bit with another one of these medical recommendations that are based on theory and don't work out in the real world. Dr. Spock, probably the most influential pediatrician of his time, he's responsible for all the baby boomers, so you can take that whichever way you want, was the one that recommended the value of sleeping on your stomach, prone sleeping. And it wasn't until 1955 that his advice began to change, and he began to talk about sleeping on your back. And SIDS had been around for some time, and it was very unclear what the cause was. And that's why I did actually find the paper interesting. So a little bit of background physiology just to put things in perspective. Our breathing is not driven by our need for oxygen. It's driven by our retention of carbon dioxide, our forgetting to exhale, as it were. In fact, we're very, very sensitive to rising levels of carbon dioxide in our blood. And so it makes more physiologic sense, at least from my point of view, that sleeping on your stomach is more inclined to get you into a situation where you can be, your breathing can be muffled or smothered, and so that you have a rising CO2 level. Now, in a normal child, a rising CO2 level will cause them to become very anxious and a lot of motor activity right away. So they'll turn themselves around, and as a result, they'll improve their overall oxygenation and blow off that CO2. So this study suggests that there's an enzyme in these children that's causing a delayed maturation, a delayed response by their respiratory physiology, so that they're not anywhere near as sensitive to carbon dioxide as a quote unquote normal child. And I think that that's a very interesting hypothesis to follow, because it certainly makes more physiologic sense than laying on your back gets you more oxygen than laying on your stomach.
So we were just talking off air about another study having to do with pesticide safety, and we were making some some snide comments about some of the details in the methodology. But when I look at this paper, this is one of the things I found impressive, is as best as I could understand it, that this was a really well-designed study, in that they're trying to measure this specific biomarker, and the enzyme is BCHE, I believe is the what it's called. So they're actually measuring this in the blood from blood samples from deceased children. But then they had a control group of healthy children, and then they had cases of children who had died from some unrelated cause. So it seems like they're actually doing pretty decent science. And then if you read the paper, they were very, very careful to preface what they were saying, to qualify what they were saying. They said, this is a small study. We need more research. This looks like we're trending in the right direction, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So, and again, I approach a lot of this stuff very, very skeptically, but even I said, this is a pretty good paper. What are your thoughts on that?
I do. I think it was well-performed science, and I agree with you that it was the discussion, which is where a lot of mischief can occur as we try to tie the dots together in the direction we want, was appropriately cautious. I think that I'm sure that you can look back on how the loss of your brother perturbed your family. The loss of a child is a huge, huge stress on a marriage. There's a lot of divorce that follows from the loss of a child. And so I think that the researchers are cognizant of that, and that came through in the tone of their discussion, and in really limiting this to saying we may have a biomarker here that will be helpful. Not that we have a treatment, and not that we have 100% answer. And I think that they are acting as responsible scientists.
I believe actually that one of the authors lost the child to SIDS. I'm not 100% about that, but I believe I read a quote somewhere where she was interacting with the media and she was talking about that. So that would very well explain why perhaps why the study was so well done and why it was so cautious. But the encouraging part of this, because sometimes, if you can find out that something's wrong or you're at risk for something, that doesn't guarantee they can do anything about it, So
this is true.
Right. So if you can, accurately predict someone's risk for Parkinson's, for example, that doesn't mean that, oh, well, great, now we can stop it. That's not possible at this point, as far as I know. But with something like this, if you have a measurable biomarker, then it may be it may be relatively easy to start developing interventions that you can direct specifically at children who might have this right. defect, if you want to call it that.
I mean, we have a technology to do that. We can do pulse oximetry, and measure the oxygen level, which is the key to the patient's demise, but is not the proximate cause of the loss of oxygen. But we can identify low oxygen levels, and that can certainly be ported into a phone or an app. So there's a lot of technology that's available. It would not make sense to do this across all kids because it would cause needless worry for new parents. But if we can identify, hopefully with this kind of a biomarker, a high-risk group, that would be a real step forward.
Yes, very, very encouraging. Now, the other aspect of the story that was really fascinating to watch play out was how the media handled this. And I think you can attest to this too. Many times, journalists, they're on a deadline. They've got to get a story out. You know, the embargo lifts on a paper and you got to get your stuff. Like, you have to get it online so you can get viewers. And that happened in this case where you had a lot of media outlets coming out and they were saying cure for SIDS, or excuse me, cause of SIDS identified, you know, like these really leading questions, or sometimes, and there was one outlet in particular called Biospace. They actually were very, very ahead of the, I don't know, jump the gun, whatever you want to say about it. But they had commentary in their article like, well, now it may not be necessary to use these typical interventions to prevent SIDS for most children. And even in the headline, they said, you know, cause of SIDS pinpointed. And so they had overstepped, you know, as we were just talking about. The paper was very cautious, but the media coverage was very much exaggerated. Now, what you normally see is 4 or 5 copycat articles from major news outlets because they're all working from the press release and they're probably working from a pre-written quote from one of the researchers that's involved in the study. And that's all you get if you're a media consumer. But in this case, Biospace put out this story, and then Newsweek, The Verge, and Slate all put out what in my estimation, were really good articles in that they were contextualizing their results. And with respect, they were saying these other outlets have jumped the shark. And I thought that was very helpful because what I normally see, and as I explain this in the story, what I normally see is they all make the same mistake. No one ever goes back and corrects it. And then they just move on to the next story and they do it again. But in this case, I think you saw the media doing what the media should do, which is sort of like a post peer review check on what consumers are told about scientific research.
Oh, yeah. I think that one of the key points in your article was the fact that journalists were able to self-correct. And, you know, we've talked previously about all the incentives there are to get something out in print right away. And in the attention economy, which has been with us for hundreds of years, it's just been amplified today by the computers. If it bleeds, it leads. And what could lead better than a cure for a horrible, devastating childhood illness? But when you peel it back and you look at the science, it's not quite there. So there's a lot of clickbait in the media because of the incentives to gather eyeballs. But it's refreshing to see that there are still journalists that are willing to self-correct and point out the errors in the reporting of others. Gives you hope.
Yeah. It's very hope-inducing, shall we say. And it wasn't just that there were reporters out there willing to correct the errors, but the reporters who made the errors, and in this case, again, I'm talking about Biospace, they actually updated the headline. And instead of saying cause pinpointed, they said important biomarker for SIDS pinpointed. So that, I think, effectively summed up what the results were. And then they put a very lengthy correction at the bottom of the article. And they said, hey, you know, we, in so many words, I'm paraphrasing, we exaggerated these results a little bit. We're in contact with the lead author and we've updated our article. And as time goes on, we're going to pay closer attention to this. And that was the great thing. And I've noticed this too in my career as a science writer, because there are times when I have made technical mistakes or whatever. And I try to prevent that by being in contact with people like Chuck, who have relevant expertise and who can make sure that I'm following the data carefully. But when you're willing to do that, when you're willing to humble yourself a little bit, even if you have to eat a little bit of crow, you become better, you know, and in my opinion, my estimation of a journalist who does that goes up because they're willing to say, I'm going to adapt to whatever reality is actually telling us, whatever the evidence is actually telling us. And the thing that I struggle with, though, is I wonder how we get this to become more common in the media, because for the most part, I don't see it. When you talk about pesticide safety or food safety or vaccine safety, I mean, even when the message that they're giving you is correct, there's a tendency to use very emotive language, or the story is framed in such a way that it's going to mislead people. So I don't know. I think maybe in this case, it's because you're dealing with deceased young children that everybody kind of feels this urge to get it right. But on other issues, the risk is a little bit further removed. And so we're not as concerned maybe about getting the facts right. I don't know. But do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to get reporters to do this more often?
Well, I think it's tough. I mean, I think that this gets to become an issue of trust. And I think, you would probably have more trust in their reporting now because they recognize the problem and they corrected it. Trust is based not on the fact that we're always right, but that when we're wrong, we're able to admit to it and try and correct the underlying problem. So there's that piece. The other part that makes me a little bit less hopeful has to do with the fact that the way we consume media now is driven far more by short sentences and colorful descriptions, all of which appeal to our visual, emotional brain rather than to our analytic brain. And for a long time, the media appealed to our analytic side, and that was no good either. But the internet has brought images and emotions back to communication, and I think the pendulum may have swung a bit too far. And so you're really stuck with this word choices by journalists in order to gather eyeballs. And I can gather more eyeballs by making people angry than I can by giving them the good news that, we saved 500 trees today. That doesn't play very well. And so to that degree, I'm a little concerned that we're not going to fix the problem until we take a real break from social media as our news source.
Yeah, I don't see that happening, sadly. This is anecdotal, but if you want to sort of verify what Chuck's saying here, and I've done this, go look at a magazine like The Atlantic, go look at the stories that they were publishing in the 1960s and the early 1970s, and just look at how the stories are framed, look at how the arguments that they're making are very nuanced. And there's an attention to detail, and there's a willingness to sit with the reader and walk them through a very complicated issue. And I saw this, for example, with some articles that Henry Hazlitt had written about economic policy at the time. And he was a major economics writer for the New York Times. And he wrote Economics in One Lesson, that famous book that probably many people have read. But there's a very careful analysis going on at that time. And if you compare that today, the Atlantic is still a really great magazine, but there's a palpable shift in the coverage of all these different issues. And indeed, even in the issues they're covering. So maybe that's the first step, is that we're aware of this radical transformation that's occurred, and maybe we can kind of temper it as a result.
And let me add, by the way, this is on both sides of the political aisle.
Yes.
Both sides do this.
Yes.
Long think pieces and analysis are just not getting looked at the same way the 5-paragraph story about he did this or he should have done that and this one got indicted for that play.
Absolutely. Well, I guess the message is always the same then. Just pay careful attention to what you're reading. Check your own biases. I still have this problem. I don't mean to put myself above everyone and say, let me educate you, because we all do it. There's always that urge when you read something that you think disagrees with whatever your presuppositions are to go, oh, this is a bad guy. I'm going to go find the errors that the bad guy made, so.
That's so funny because you said that, because I was just reading a book the other day and I found myself agreeing with the authors on so many things, and then I Googled them and discovered that they really were from a political perspective that I really, really do not like. And I had to call into question why I was so happy with what they were saying before I knew anything about their politics. That's a bias. It's a bias in there.
Yeah. Hey, just a quick question. This just occurred to me. Did that change what they had actually written that you thought was beneficial? Or was it just that once you realized that, like, oh, they had an R or a D next to their name, then you were like, okay, no thanks.
My first response was, okay, no thanks. But then I realized that, I was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And that when you go back and you read it, a lot of things that they were saying still held a great deal of weight. And the discordance was in my head, not in what they were writing. It was because I just said, hey, no, how could I possibly believe what those people have to say? And that's a problem. But at least I caught myself in the act and was able to correct myself and say, no, some of the things that they're saying still hold good water.
Yeah, that's great. You mentioned on a previous episode something to the effect of you should read people who disagree with you if for no other reason than to make your arguments stronger.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there's a lot of value in that. I'm looking over at my bookshelf, and there's some books on there by people I know I adamantly disagree with on certain issues. But because I read their scholarship, not only have I learned a lot, but I have a better understanding of where they're coming from and, how to refine my own thinking. So applying that to what we see here, you can approach all sorts of media. And even if you look at it and you go, I know I'm going to disagree with a lot of this, there might still be some nuggets of truth in there for you to take home.
The biggest treatment for misinformation is curiosity. And, I think one of the nice things about our listenership and our readership is that they remain scientifically curious. And I think that's to their advantage and hopefully to our advantage too.
Well, there you go, guys. Pat yourselves on the back for being so open-minded, because it does go a long way. I think it makes a difference. And it's encouraging to us when we write stuff that we know there's people that are going to be critical at certain points, but they're actually willing to engage with the content. So we're going to leave it there for the week. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to get these articles that we talk about on the podcast in your inbox, you just go to our website, go up to the subscribe tab at the top, punch in your email address, and a few times a week we'll send you our dispatch newsletter, and you'll get the content right in your inbox so you don't have to go searching for it. And then when you listen to this podcast, you'll know what we're talking about. But in any case, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. The show's available pretty much everywhere. So Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. So if you listen to this show, go onto those apps, rate us, give us a review. It makes a big difference in helping more people get this science-based content. And with that, we're going to leave it, and we will see you next week.